Today, we're continuing with how relationships adjust when expectations start shifting. In this episode, we'll look at how closeness and distance begin to balance out once long standing patterns loosen, and why connection often feels steadier when it's no longer held together by effort. When expectations change, one of the first things people notice is a difference in proximity. Not physical distance, but emotional distance. How close you feel, how often you check in, how much reassurance feels necessary. At first, this can feel uncertain. If you've both been used to maintaining closeness through responsiveness, availability, or emotional management, stepping back even slightly can feel like something important is missing. You might wonder whether connection will weaken or drift. What often happens instead is a rebalancing. Closeness that depends on constant adjustment tends to feel fragile. It needs attention to stay in place. When patterns change, that kind of closeness either adapts or falls away. What remains is usually quieter but more stable. You might notice this in everyday interactions, and conversations don't need to be filled in the same way. Silences don't immediately need explaining. Time apart doesn't automatically register as distance. Connection feels less conditional. This shift can feel unfamiliar at first. When you're used to working to maintain closeness, ease can feel strange. You may find yourself checking whether things are okay simply because they feel calmer. Over time, many people realize that closeness doesn't disappear when effort reduces, it changes shape. It becomes less reactive and more consistent, less about monitoring and more about presence. Distance changes as well. Instead of feeling like absence, distance becomes space. Space to think, space to recover, space to respond rather than react. This doesn't mean disengagement, it means flexibility. Early in the series, we explored how expectations quietly organize relationships. When those expectations loosen, people are less likely to interpret distance as threat. A delayed response doesn't immediately mean disconnection. A quieter period doesn't automatically mean something is wrong. This is where balance begins to form. Closeness is no longer driven by anxiety about losing connection. Distance is no longer experienced as something that must be corrected. In practical terms, this often shows up as fewer internal calculations, less wondering how often you should reach out, less tracking of tone or timing. Interaction becomes more natural because it's less managed. People often notice that when they stop chasing closeness, others move toward them more freely. Not always immediately, but over time. When pressure drops, connection tends to feel safer for everyone involved. This doesn't mean relationships become perfectly symmetrical. People still want different levels of closeness. What changes is how those differences are handled. There's more tolerance for variation without it becoming personal. Another important shift is how people relate to moments of distance that do not feel comfortable. Instead of acting quickly to resolve them, there's more capacity to sit with the feeling. Distance becomes something that can be noticed rather than fixed. This is one of the places where counseling quietly supports change. Not by directing people to behave differently, but by helping them experience closeness and distance without immediately responding to the discomfort that they bring up. Over time, that experience changes how connection is held. As this balance develops, relationships often feel less effortful, not because people care less, but because care isn't being used to regulate anxiety in the same way. Connection becomes something that exists rather than something that's maintained. You may notice that you feel less responsible for keeping things close, less pressure to perform connection, more freedom to engage when it feels genuine. This balance doesn't remove moments of uncertainty, it changes how much weight those moments carry. Closeness and distance become part of a rhythm rather than signals to act on. If you're staying with this and finding it useful, following the show keeps these episodes together so the thread continues without interruption. In the next episode, we'll move further into how this steadier balance affects emotional confidence over time and why people often feel more secure without needing to define exactly why.